Okay, thanks everybody for coming this morning to this CUR seminar series. I will introduce Wofgang in a second, but I'd just like to acknowledge that we meet today on traditional lands of the Wurrung and Burrung speaking peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and thank Indigenous people who are present today, elders past, present, and extend our respect to Indigenous Australians around the country, and thank them for their continuing care for this country. So today we are joined by Wofgang Wiesser. Did I do that terribly?
No, perfect.
Okay. Who is an ecologist, a professor at the Technical University of Munich, and I might get him to tell us a bit more about himself, but we will hear it. But we're very welcome and very interested to hear what you have to say today. Thanks for joining us. So Wolfgang's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the nice introduction. I hope I can be heard. Otherwise, please interrupt me. So I'm a biologist. I normally work on the effect of land use and biodiversity in forests, grasslands. And in a few years, I'm responsible at the TU Munich also for teaching landscape architects and a little bit architects. And this is how I came into contact with the urban environment. And I would like to present some of the work that has followed from this. And I normally talk in front of either landscape architects or biologists. So I think this is now a much wider and much more professional audience. So I would be very grateful for some feedback on what I'm telling. So I would like to first talk about cities as the unlikely place for wildlife, then talk about the relationship between urban fauna and animal occurrences, and how we can modify human design for animals, and some open questions. So when I was following landscape architecture, I asked myself, why is there no urban planning for animals? Is there only urban planning for humans? And with a lot of discussion of my colleague Thomas Haug, who's a landscape architect, I think we have the feeling that this has a very deep root. And the deep root is the separation that man has made himself between man and nature as a paradigm of modernity. So the city and the landscape or wilderness are considered as separate spheres of man and nature. And the city is the place of the civilized human, and the nature is the place of the wild animal. And as a consequence, we have been very systematic in the past to exclude wild animals, but in the last 150 years also farm animals, and actually all animals that we don't want to have from the urban space. And in contrast, we have the idea that we have to protect wilderness and have designated protected wilderness areas where then, according to this view, there should be no humans, so that we have this separation also in conservation. So urban planning for animals does not exist because there are no animals in the city according to our view of what the city should be. And I've come across this animal geography, which is discussing this a lot, and I found this very intriguing. Now, unfortunately, animals have never followed the rules that humans have set. And when animals then leave the spaces that we allocate to them, they're expelled by force. We have laws of hygiene, laws of hunting, and this is all to deal with the animals that they're not supposed to be. Now, this view of the separation, I think, is actually wrong, because humans and animals have never been separated in the past, neither when we were hunter-gatherers in the open landscape, nor when we had the first villages, or even in pre-industrial times. There were always lots of animals around us that we have perceived but never thought a lot about it. And only in the last 30 years or so, we have been able to really expel most of animals from our cities, and this is still continuing. And we only end up with those that can still survive, the rats, the pigeon, the ones that we don't necessarily want. And this ignorance of the nature around us is actually reflected in the history of ecology, because ecologists like to go to the national parks and to nice places where there's a lot of wildlife. And it's only in the 1980s in Berlin and some other places where they started some surveys of plants and then animals in the city. And still today, we consider the current of animals in cities as something very special. And we have a lot of words for this. We call it novel ecosystem, socio-ecological system, urban avoiders, making the city somehow special compared to any other place in the that is also actually influenced by humans. And we've done a study where we took data from public sources to actually ask how many species that occur, in this case in 30 cities in Germany, actually also occur in the surroundings of the city. And so this good thing about this data is it goes a lot of taxa from amphibians up to spiders. And then we looked at a 50-kilometer radius, and we asked how many occur only outside the city, which is the dark bar. Then how many occur only in the city, very few, and how many occur in both the city and the environment, the surroundings. And you see that almost 50% of all across all taxa also occur within city borders. Now, of course, they don't occur everywhere, but they do occur inside city borders. And if we then take all the 30 cities into one big pool and ask, does the species occur in any of the city anywhere, then we find that this proportion goes up to 80%. So even today, even though animals are quite rare, many species actually occur in the city borders, and it's the humans that influence where they can and where they cannot occur.
Big question, what is taxa?
Taxa is it's a group of animals that has that is related. So all mammals, for example,
Okay.
all insects.
Oh.
And there also seems to be, despite our separation, there seems to be some sort of desire to be among animals. So any rendering you have in an architecture competition always has some animals in it. We don't really plan for them, but without the animal, our design does not seem to be complete. Okay. So I think we're still quite bad in understanding why certain animals occur where inside the city. And I think we can distinguish two types of areas within the city. One is the remnants of natural habitats, large parks, areas with high conservation values. Those have been studied a lot in the past, and there's where we find a lot of wildlife. But there's also the build-up area of the city where the planning is primarily for humans. And those, and work here actually, so also on this, there we can also have a lot of wildlife. And if we think about, or if we want to increase the interaction between animals and humans in the city, I think we have to really also take a focus on those areas, simply because there's classic solutions to separate humans and nature also within the city, like having a national park or protected area inside the city, and the rest is for the human. Doesn't work because there's simply not enough space for such habitat. There's too little valuable habitat left. The existing protection is actually weak, and there's also little support of city dwellers of being excluded from certain areas of the city.
I mean, city, animal dwellers or human dwellers?
Animal dwellers.
Animal dwellers, yeah.
So they, yeah. And so the alternative then is, and that is what Sarah's group has been pioneering here a lot, is to incorporate ecological knowledge also into the design of the built environment. And this ecological knowledge, I think we still have to work on. We have to understand why certain animals occur where. And we have started a project which we call the 100 Squares. This is why squares. This is the typical urban structure. It's like the center of a city. It's the result of human design that is strongly urbanized, a lot of impervious surface. And we find them in all sorts of sizes, and they're all publicly accessible. That's one of the definitions of a public square. And then on the In the first instance, we are still ongoing quantifying the urban form. We are mapping all the green vegetation or trees or shrubs or grass land, but we're also looking increasingly at man-made structures as the predictor variables. This gives you the overview of this 100 squares. We try to select the 100 squares in a way that we disentangle greenness and proximity to city center. So normally you have more impervious surface towards the city center, but actually if you look carefully, you can also find green squares closer to the city center and gray squares also closer to the border of the city. And then we did what we always do in our other work. We do some biodiversity surveys. We look at birds, arthropods, pollinators, mosses, spontaneous vegetation. By the way, this is what Catherine as well. Bats, small mammals, and then we also have a multi-diversity index across all the different taxa. So this is a complicated graph. I go through this slowly. So these bars here show you the richness of the different taxa, arthropods, bats, birds, mosses, in these 103 squares. And you see there's quite a bit of difference from the ones on the left to the ones on the right. Yeah, so there's quite a big difference between the diversity of urban squares. The green line tells you the greenness of the square as taken from the from aerial photographs and DBI. You can already see a correlation, and the blue line is actually the correlation. The average greenness across this. The multi-diversity, so across all the taxa of the squares. And this relationship that multi-diversity increase with greenness is nicely seen on the right-hand side, where green is on the x-axis and multi-diversity is on the y-axis. So there's a strong relationship between how green the squares and how many different types of animals you find there. And below you see the relationship for all the different groups. Just bed activity, bed richness is not related to greenness, and also pest mammal, or mice, for example. Pigeon abundance is not related, but the others show generally a positive relationship. However, it's not just green that is important, and that's, I guess, one of the main messages. If you then look into the different components of green, which is and some other variables, this is the variables here on the y-axis, so square size, distance from city center, proportion of surfaces grass, proportion of green 1 kilometer radius. You see two things. One is that for every taxon, here the pollinators and mosses, arthropods, so insects, birds, species richness and abundance, pest mammal activity, small mammal activity, plants, bats. So all of them are influenced by several factors. And those factors, just if we look at the distribution of the arrows, so if it goes up, it means it's a positive relationship, and if it's yellow, it's very strong. So different variables are important for different taxa. So it's not just that the screen has to be green, it also depends on the composition of the green. And this is still a very coarse description of what the vegetation of the urban square. So humans influence this, but the type of green we plant strongly influences the diversity we find in the squares. And you can then, of course, look into the different taxa more in details. For example, this is bird nesting. And if we divide them into ground nesting birds, arboreal nesting birds, cavity nesting birds, you see that there are different relationships. So, for example, the ground nesting birds are negatively influenced by the number of cats and dogs that we observed on photos on the plant. The size of the square is positively related to just the cavity nested arboreal nesters. Tree density does not affect the ground nesting birds, and so on. So you go into detail, you find out more about the different skills, and you can look at various traits of the animals and try to understand more closely what's important for. One example, the feral pigeon behaves differently than all the other birds. For example, you see it decreases with increasing greenness, and it increases with increasing number of people. So pigeons and people have very similar requirements of these squares. So to conclude this, urban squares and Munich are habitat for diverse assemblage of wild animals. So even in this in the heart of the city, we have a lot of species. Greener squares are used by more individuals and more species. There are differences in the responses of the different animal groups. And I think we need to describe the urban form in more detail to understand how it is linked to the resources and the disturbances, the resources that animal needs and the disturbances that maybe prevent the occurrence of animals. Okay, so if we know this, then we can start also planning for animals if we want to do this. Now I will be a little bit briefer because I have given this talk already. This bit of the talk to some people at least, which is the approach that Thomas and I have developed to include animals into city planning, which is conversion to biodiversity sensitive urban design that Sarah developed. We were completely ignorant of the work at RMIT when we did this. So we looked at the situation of, in this particular case, project planning, and asked what do we need to do in order to make animals part of this? And we realized three challenges. One is that there's a lack of a systematic design approach. So nobody knows how to systematically design animals into urban planning procedures. Any planning for animals has to be aligned with the standard planning procedures. And then we have this gap between amenity and biodiversity that humans like the design places and let nature be nature is not a strategy that we can use for the urban environments. So this is what we wanted to address with something that we call animal-aided design as a method to include animals into landscape architecture, a methodology that's supposed to improve urban design and create habitats for target species. So the idea is that you make animal species the integral part of the design. In order to do so is actually quite simple. You choose animals at the beginning of the planning process. You identify what we call critical factors, the resources in the animal life cycle that they need. And then you let the animal life cycle inspire design so that the designers can actually be inspired by the requirements of the animal. And this is why we call it animal-aided design. So the idea is that it's good design, now bridging the gap between amenity and biodiversity, that is good design for humans, but that also benefits animals. And that is aligned with the planning process that we have. So there's an analysis and draft phase. And at this early phase, we have to choose what kind of species we want to design for. And we do a compilation of the requirements, which we call species portrait. And then comes the detailed planning design phase, where we have to design for the human and also for the animal. And then it's being constructed, and we have to be present there, and then we have to do some evaluation if it works out. So we came up with this format for species portraits, which has a lot of information on the species for everybody, but it has sort of this design language, and we have the critical factors, what needs to be fulfilled for an animal to be there. And this can be translated to some checklist, where in theory, the designer just has to tick off boxes and see if he or she has actually not forgotten any of the requirements of the animal. I think what is very important, and that's also, I think, important message to ecologists that they know, but sometimes maybe not realize, animals do not mind the design as long as it's functional. Maybe they do mind, I don't know. But basically, like the sun bath that most birds need in order to dust their feathers against parasites, this can be, this open circle around a tree. This is in Berlin, but it can also be a design space on the top of a kindergarten roof, or it can be along a footpath. So as long as the texture of the sand is fine, it's fine for the animal. And this means that the designer, when she or he has to design with sand, is actually very free in the imagination of how to incorporate this into design. And we have started to look at a number of case studies, and this is just one typical redensification project in Munich, where there used to be this open meadow, and then there was an old post-war kindergarten, and then this is now replaced by new housing, and all the trees have to go because there's an underground garage and so on. So under normal circumstances, there would be no provision for animals whatsoever. We chose 4 target species. The biggest red bat, hedgehog, the European hedgehog, the house sparrow, and a green woodpecker. And then this is just an impression of some of the measures we try to integrate. So in the facade, you can integrate breeding spaces. For the hedgehog, we came up with a hedgehog door where it can stay over the day. This is the sand bath on top of the shed of the kindergarten. And then, because there's so little space, we also modified the green roof a little bit in order to have more insects being able to survive. And we also had a designed nest box for the green woodpecker. So there are many more individual measures. The idea is that in the end, you can locate all the resources in the plant. So you have a theoretical proof that all the animal needs is actually there. And you know where the animal is supposed to feed, where it has to drink water, and so on. So you can actually you can improve, and then later, of course, we have to verify that it works the way you want it to work. Okay, so in the last part, I would like to come to some open question and be so brave to delve a little bit into social ecology, and I'm happy for criticisms. So one is, that's, I think, a more biological question. What is the urban niche, where we have to really try to define? We are talking about that connectivity at the level of the home range may play an important role. But also what I noticed is that we know very little about human-animal relationship. We know very little about how humans like animals, because the categories that are mostly used in human-animal studies are very broad. There is the companion animal, there is the animal that we use for farming, and there are the others. But the others are actually a lot. Most animals are others. So the question is, do we distinguish between these others and what do we know? And interestingly, there's not so much work on this. So we started with a very simple study where we try to ask people to what animals they like. So liking an animal, of course, depends on the animal attributes, depends on the cultural background of the people, it depends on personal experience, it may depend on personal personality. And so it's a complicated thing. So in this particular case, we ask students how familiar are they with 100 different animals, and these are very common animals, and how much do they like them. And the only thing you have to see here is that it varies. Yeah, so both attitude and familiarity varies. Familiarity may also depend on the animals, so some are maybe less known, but also the attitude varies. And interestingly, you would assume that better known animals are more liked, but that's not the case. What we find is actually the more an animal is known, or people think they know it, they either like it or they hate it. So the extremes get stronger. And if you just look at the variability in answers as a function of familiarity, you see the variability increases as people become more familiar. So they're more neutral towards animals they don't really know, but as soon as they know them, they have strong opinions. And of course, even within one animal, you can have people differing a lot. And then the next question we have is how, if people could choose, where would they put an animal? So again, we work together with psychologists, but I'm sure you can do it in many other ways as well. So we had a questionnaire that we distributed in Munich, where we basically had 32 animals, and we asked basically people, where should this animal live? And we offered them a number of choices. And importantly, they were allowed to give the same animal different places. So not just the best one, but everywhere where they think this animal should occur. Starting from the home, the balcony, the garden, somewhere in the neighborhood, somewhere in the city park, somewhere in the city, outside of the city, or nowhere. Nowhere meaning shouldn't exist at all. You see the cockroach and the rat. Had quite a few people. The darker the green, the more people sort of voted this. So there's very few animals for which there's no place. But importantly, you see it gets greener as you go from left to right. So there's a place for every animal. Yeah, but not so close to home. And I think that's an important message, because when we talk about like conservation for animals, we don't need people to want them in their house or in their garden. We want them to be tolerant that they occur in the city, and that they can maybe choose themselves, even though we didn't ask this, when to interact with them. And they do accept that the animals occur in the city, but they also think that all animals really should also occur outside the city. So if we now then take this together, the probability of placing animal across all animals, you see in the home, basically almost nobody. Only the house cat is allowed at home. Balcony also very little. Interestingly, garden also very little. So those people, that's something we look at, that have a garden, they don't actually want so many animals in their garden, even though animals are an important source of resources in the city. But if it goes further, then you see neighborhood, city park, and city, even though actually a city park and city is not so different. Spatially, it's in terms of perceived distance, apparently a difference. And nowhere, as I said, is only few. And we can also, that's something we try to classify this into relation scales, which is not necessarily the physical distance, but how people feel what's actually close to them, not so close. So the home zone is home, garden, balcony. That's where people don't really want animals, or only few. The neighborhood scale, more accepted than the city scale. And when we then plot mean attitude against how close they are, or how far they place from home, then you see a weak relationship, but there is a relationship. So, but with a lot of variability. So generally, the ones that we like more, they're allowed a little bit closer to home. But there's a lot of scattering. Okay, so then I'm through. So I think cities are actually not so special. They are a very heterogeneous landscape where the local conditions determine what animals may occur there. I think every system where humans interfere, which is most systems, agriculture also, is a socio-ecological system. So I don't think a city is so different there, at least from the point of the animals. Open questions concern the urban niche and urban community assembly. I think urban forms can be modified to allow more animals to occur in the built-up area of the city, and therefore we need cooperation with planning disciplines and tangible solutions, and this is what people do here very, very wonderfully. And understanding why humans like or dislike certain animals and why they're tolerated offers entrance points for wildlife inclusive design and environmental education. And therefore we have to cooperate with humanities, because ecologists do this. It's not normally very good. And with this, I would like to take some questions. Thank you very much.